Hi, I'm James from Chaosium. I sat down with Mike Mason, who is the creative director of Call of Cthulhu, and we talked about globetrotting campaigns. In a lot of games of Call of Cthulhu, you will find yourself traveling all over the world, and Mike shares some tips and tricks about how to make sessions involving travel as exciting as possible. I'll jump across to the interview in just a moment, but first, please remember to subscribe, and thanks for watching.
There's no answer to that. You travel as far as the story takes you. Um, so the big dividing line is a scenario, a one-off scenario and a campaign. In a one-off scenario, 99% of the time they are set in a single location, be it a city, a town, even just a haunted house. But with potential to maybe go between a few different points, maybe beyond the city, or maybe even to two cities, but often not much more than that, because otherwise they start to look like campaigns, because they're more than just a handful of sessions play. They start to take on months of play because there's more to do, and it really comes down to how much plot story is there involved. So travel really just comes down to the necessity of the story that's being told, I guess.
When you are thinking of one of the most globe-trotting adventures out there, as opposed to a submarine episode, for want of a better word, just as a quick example, can you give us two campaigns or scenarios to illustrate the different extremes?
Sure. Okay, so Masks of Nyarlathotep is probably the most well-known globe-trotting campaign, in that you go to multiple different countries across different continents, and to in the course of the story. The other extreme would be something like A Time to Harvest, which you do visit different cities, different locations, but they are all in the Northeast US. So you're not traveling, well, there's a potential you could travel to Canada for a little episode, but they're all in Northeast US. But you're not traveling across, the Atlantic to England or to Africa or beyond. And so that's much more self-contained. Another one similar to that is the Pulp campaign, A Cold Fire Within, which again is set within a much smaller kind of geographical area, but has the potential to kind of go beyond there, without giving too many spoilers away. But something like Masks, or the other big globe-trotting campaign is the Pulp campaign, Two-Headed Serpent, where again you are traveling to different countries in the course of the campaign, and dealing with things that are happening in those locales.
I think that when you talk about globetrotting campaigns, there's two immediate reactions. There's, wow, that's cool, and wow, that could be complicated. I'll talk about a lot of the complexities that arise and some of the tools that exist to mitigate those, but let's talk about the exciting aspects first. To state the obvious, just why is it cool to be able to globetrot all over the place when you're playing a game of Call of Cthulhu?
It's well, there's a number of things. One, it's that kind of sense of adventure, and the kind of experiencing kind of different places, different cultures, different people. Things look different, sound, smell, taste different, as it were. When you go abroad, and it changes the kind of the safety net of the setting. Because if you're playing in the kind of a familiar setting, which could be, depending on your group, the Northeast US, Boston and Markham and so forth, or London in England, or somewhere like that, where there's lots of scenarios written in those kind of locations, and the players are familiar with them, and they kind of they know their way around to some degree. Whereas the wonder is taking them out of that fish out of water kind of thing, where they go somewhere they don't know, that opens them up to more kind of possibilities, and also the unknown in that sense as well. And particularly if you're playing, with a group of players that, personally in real life kind of know the Boston area, New England area reasonably well anyway, because they live there or have visited or whatever. taking them somewhere where they personally have never been as real people kind of amplifies the effect on their character, because they just genuinely don't really know. So it's all new to them. So you are kind of introducing new elements, which a lot of the time you can hang, minor plot hooks on, or even the major, the major hook of the plot on.
Before we even touch on learning about a new location, it can be hard to learn about travel. The 1920s was a very different time, and flying wasn't a big thing. You tended to jump on boats. I've never really been on a boat, at least not a cross-continental boat. How do you find out about the details of travel, and how do you make those things feel authentic?
I think you have to kind of take a step back and first ask yourself, if you are running a game where travel is involved, and it's not just a quick train journey from A to B and you move on. If you're talking sea voyages or zeppelins or airplanes, and whatever period you're playing, number one, ultimately you've got to ask yourself, does travel play a role in the actual story? Because there's two answers to that, yes or no. If it's no, and actually it's actually just connecting the investigators to different parts of the scenario or scenarios, if it's a campaign, then it's really just travel from A to B. And like most times in real life, the travel is the dull bit, and we get on and then we get off and then we move on. So you can kind of red line that travel and literally just say it took place. Now you're arrived, let's get on with the scenario. And so it's a very simple kind of way to handle travel. You don't need to worry about it. Basically, you just say, well, you've got on the plane, you've now landed, let's move on. However, if the story kind of can make use of the travel in some way, then obviously that's almost like a interconnecting scenario or scene between the scenarios in your travel. So, but you've got to think about what can happen in the travel. And that opens up a number of possibilities, but there is a danger that literally anywhere the PCs go is going to be the threat of the mythos, which in a sense is maybe overdoing it sometimes. It's kind of like you turn left and right, there's a Shoggoth, and it's almost too much because it becomes mundane. It becomes, yet another Shoggoth on the plane. Every travel you do is an integral part of the story in that way. It's probably too much, and it becomes dull for the players. So thinking about what it means, because it could just be they meet an NPC, and in the course of the travel, there's a scene or two where they get to know the NPC, and it's really just a bit of dialogue and a bit of character interaction and development. And then later on, once they've reached their location, the NPC comes back into it, either seeking the players' characters out, or the investigators seek out that character because, do you remember the doctor we met on the plane? He was really friendly. And now you've just been half eaten by a Shoggoth. We could really use that help. So you can kind of integrate kind of NPCs in that way, or little clues or potential foreshadowing little scenario seeds that, again, the players don't really know a lot about at the moment, but they will bear fruit later on in the campaign. So those are kind of cool ways to use travel. So you're not literally paying every hour of being sat on a train or a boat, which can be dull, but you are kind of highlighting a particular scene or small sequence of scenes that actually are allied in some way to the bigger narrative. There's one other thing to take into account with travel. If you don't want to necessarily build in plot into the travel, the fallback option with travel, particularly for Call of Cthulhu, is that it's a time for the characters to develop. And that could simply mean a time for them to rest and heal all their hit points and get rid of any wounds they've got. It could be to regain sanity and connect with a backstory connection. It could be to improve skills. So, for instance, we're leaving the US on the boat, and we're going to Egypt, but none of us have any language skills. maybe if it's a big cruise liner, then there probably will be some language lessons. So you can have this, you can have the PCs going to the language lessons. Again, you don't need to role play them learning the language, but you can just say, hey, you've done the language lessons. You've now got 20%, 30%, whatever is appropriate to your story in a language skill that's going to be useful for them when they arrive. Equally, it could be any manner of skills. It could be they've done some, they've been shooting clay pigeons off the bow as part of an organized activity. So there's a chance for them to do an improvement check on their firearms skill. Or they've joined the local kind of amateur dramatics kind of group on the cruise, and they've done some plays, and so you want to be generous, so you may award them a bit of improvement in their acting skill or charm skill or fast talk. So, build in these little character development bits that make the travel a little bit more interesting. But again, it's not taking away from the plot. It's actually helping the characters to kind of get up to speed in terms of skills and so on, to help them out as they go forward in the campaign.
So to break that down in a couple of practical examples from some of the established Call of Cthulhu books, you would have a campaign like Two-Headed Serpent, where you really can just redline through large sections of it. The exciting parts, especially since it's a pulp campaign, are at the locations, versus something like Horror on the Orient Express, where the journey aboard the train is so linked to the main action. And then in the middle, you might have something like Children of Fear, where it's up to you as a keeper and your table how detailed you want to get.
Yeah, I mean, Children of Fear is a good example because there's a lot of great distances of travel between some of the key locations in that campaign, and to play that all through, even though not a lot happens during that travel, would add months and years to the actual gaming time, and there just isn't, it isn't appropriate. So there's a number of suggestions in that book about you can redline the travel, and here are some optional encounters to have. So it could be, for instance, like if you wanted to kind of insert a little skirmish with some bandits, or some kind of meeting on the road, which again, not really part of the bigger plot, but kind of add a little bit of interest and a bit of action during the travel. To the other extreme, where actually if the players get hold of certain things earlier on in the campaign, they might have access to things like a gate spell, so they can literally go from A to B by doing some sort of gate magic, because it's expedient for the story, because you want them to get from A to B quickly. And here's a way to do it. It could be they summon Bayakis and drink space mead and fly there, or whatever. But depending on how pulpy and mythosy you want that to be, it all comes down to the kind of flavor and style and tone of the particular game you're running, really.
Children of Fear also brings up something interesting, which is locations that you might not be familiar with. I didn't know much about Asia before I started playing Children of Fear, and especially if I'm in a homebrew game or something like that, I'm never sure when my players are going to decide that they want to investigate the artifact I threw in as an afterthought, and suddenly we're on a trip to the Amazon, and I realize I have to do a bunch of research into 1920s Colombia or Brazil or whatever the case may be. How do you approach that? How do you approach making a location feel exciting, doing it justice, but also not necessarily overshadowing the story you want to tell?
Yeah, I mean, this is where there's a massive rabbit hole that some keepers really love to go into, and others really haven't got the time or the inclination. And so it really comes to a balance of what your personal preference is as a keeper. Obviously, let's just go back to the first rule of any game. Never put something in you're not prepared to follow up on. So if you have put in an artifact from the Amazon without intending the player to ever go to the Amazon or look into it in any detail, and then they, you know what they're going to do, they're always going to do that thing. Just don't put the artifact in, put something else in that you are happy to do. But in terms of research, there's what we try to do in the books is, obviously we could fill they're in R&D. Many books are just filled with details about one location that aren't game books, and there's a lot to kind of spend your time reading if you so wish. But really what we come down to is, what is the setting? It is background to the scenario. That is, we aren't playing the game to do a travelogue, to just listen to the keeper explaining in monologue about a setting, and listening to the keeper for an hour going on about, what does the marketplace look like in the bazaar? What do the people look like? What are the smells? And all the rest of it. We will get bored very quickly because we're not role playing at that point. We're just listening to somebody reading a book to us, basically. So what you want to do is like a shorthand of these things. So you do want to, what do they see? What can they hear? What can they smell? Depending on the location. And really, it's just a sentence or two on those things. And 9 out of 10 times, even if you know nothing about a particular place, you can probably make a reasonably educated guess as to how to describe those 3 things, such as you are in a fishing port, therefore there's a strong smell of the ocean and the salt on the breeze, and it's a bit bitingly cold, and it's the sky is grey. I know, I've never been there, but I can, I've seen enough in life to kind of gather that that's what that location might be. And that's probably enough, because I've set the scene, and now we're into what are they doing as players? What do you want to do? Well, we want to go here, and we want to do that, and we want to do that. It's got nothing to do with the location, really. That is background setting. That is your set dressing. And that's the kind of the baseline of it. Then anything above that is really comes down to your personal preference as a keeper, as long as you balance it with the dynamic of the actual play experience, because no one wants to hear you moaning on and on, describing to the nth degree, what every sailor in the fishing port looks like, and what the condition of their boats, and what did they catch today, and all that. It's all completely irrelevant, really, to the plot, if the plot is about something happening in the university a mile down the road. So balance out your description, but it's really shorthand, little pieces, nuggets of information that the players can kind of allow their imagination to kind of build upon. So sight, smell, sound, and so forth is just presenting the backdrop, because really the next thing you're going to be talking about is actually that strange car over there with them men who appear to be watching you. That's actually the scenario, and that's where you're going to direct the players to, because that's what they're going to interact with or want to interact with.
I think that's fantastic advice, and it's the best way to play. You can feel when you're at the table, when you can lean into those moments, when you need to pull back. For the rest of the video, though, I'm going to continue under the assumption that we are playing in a campaign or a scenario where that sort of stuff is at the forefront. So everyone at the table is very invested. Let me ask you how you deal with minor logistical details, which is such a weird thing to say. There's a couple of scenarios, campaigns I can think of, particularly in extended stories, where it suddenly becomes very relevant whether you can get a ticket on a particular train, or suddenly you have to figure out a new way of traveling and air isn't an option, or suddenly you need to get a boat and you need to transport something, and you can bring up logistical things that you might not have been prepared for. How do you see those? How do you deal with those without it feeling very out of place given the rest of the context of the story?
Again, always come back to the needs of the story. If the scenario has been set up in such a way, or you've managed to kind of slightly mishandle it, and suddenly they're on a deadline that you thought they'd have loads of time to get to, the mountain, and suddenly you realize, they've realized, it's literally in 2 hours' time, then you've got to decide okay, are we building to a wonderful climax and this is the nature of the story, or are we going for fine detail, authentic narrative that's based on real life, and therefore it means we could never get to the mountain in 2 hours' time. It's going to take them 24 hours in real life. So how do we kind of make the two work in a sense? Because if you go with the reality option, they're going to miss the big climax, and it's a bit dull, and they don't get to finish the scenario in the way that they thought, or they can watch the world disintegrate around them because they didn't get there in time. And that might be a fitting ending if it's been the player's choice to muck around and avoid everything, and they have dilled and dallied, knowing full well that if they weren't at this place at this time, they won't get to stop it. If they made a conscious choice and it's, agreed upon, then that outcome is fine, because that's, they chose to not deal with the horror, and this is the consequence. And then you can work out what that means in play. However, otherwise, you're looking at kind of just going, okay, we're going to say, because we've got, the game sessions running short and we need to move on, we're just going to cut to you arrived, and not worry about the logistics, because actually nobody plays Call of Cthulhu to worry about logistics or accountancy. Nobody plays them because of those two things alone. They may become important in the scenario if it's relevant to the story. If not, they are dull, so don't worry about it. Just cut to they got there. It doesn't matter how they got there, because that's not important to the story. What's important is they got there, and now you can say, what are you doing to stop Shub Niggurath being summoned? Which is the whole point of the end of the climax. So it really again comes down to style, the nature and style of the game you're playing, how you handle those moments. Because like what happens in films, we need to go, oh look, there's a taxi going by, quick, grab that taxi, we're off. It's not a big problem. It's really just helping the story to the momentum to go at the pace that needs to happen at that particular point.
Flicking back to the example of arriving in a new location and wanting to make it as detailed and interesting as possible, I've had a couple of scenarios where my players arrive and the session kind of turns into a tourist guide to a city. I think in some of the Horror on the Orient Express campaigns, where I had the investigators wandering through Italy and literally just taking in the sights. Obviously, you can throw in the plot, and that's an easy way to make things exciting. But if you are trying to feed that want for some players, do you have any tips on how to make seeing just the historical and cultural, aspects of the city really engaging?
Okay, well, make them personal to the investigators. Obviously, this is kind of stuff you really have got to prep if your group is into that. Now, there are some groups that will love that kind of thing and actually want to kind of get a feeling of the location before they really interact with the story and the plot. It's part of the enjoyment. There are other groups that are not interested in that at all, and they just want to keep on with the plot. Know your group and understand it. And if they are the kind of group of players that want to kind of, pile on the kind of the atmosphere and the locale, then that's where you need to do a bit of prep. And that's really coming down to, well, what am I going to highlight to them? And obviously, if it's a scenario you've written yourself, then it's really just a case of, well, just nip onto Wikipedia or something like that, or a guidebook, and what are the three most important sites in the city? Is it the big cathedral in Barcelona, or is it St. Paul's Cathedral in London, and then Buckingham Palace and Trafalgar Square? So what are the kind of things that they might know about as players, but again, not know a great deal about, but kind of have an expectation that we go to London, we're probably going to see Buckingham Palace. Therefore, you can just do a little bit of prep and just say, okay, maybe all you do is find an image, a photograph online of Buckingham Palace, so you can say, you go and see Buckingham Palace, here's what it looks like, and that's enough. Or it might be that you go on Wikipedia and you get a little bit of information about, they change the guards outside of Buckingham Palace every so often. We'll have a changing of the guard, then I can describe the soldiers changing guard and the horses and the crowds watching, and you're just adding a little bit more kind of atmosphere and flavor to it, and then move on. Obviously players are players, and somebody will then probably want to go, well, what happens if I go and punch one of the soldiers? Well, you're going to get punched back and arrested, and that's a whole new bit of the scenario you've just invented. But little snippets, really, because again, my personal taste is I don't want to listen to somebody going on and on and on about Buckingham Palace when it's got nothing to do with the scenario. I'm happy for a little bit to kind of give a bit of a, the day you arrive, you go and see Buckingham Palace and you see this and this and this, and then you go to Trafalgar and you have coffee in a cafe and it's really nice, and then you might, depending on what the players want to do, you might turn into a little senior role play because the waiter annoys them, and you just want to give them a bit of a taste of the local people, or the fact that they're dressed so inappropriately that everyone's staring at them, or nobody can understand them because everyone speaks a different language. It's just going to convey the sense that they're a little bit more isolated than before. And this is all kind of foreshadowing kind of stuff, and just kind of building in the tension. So that's how I would kind of suggest you handle it, in very bite-sized little pieces without having to spend hours doing research. Just do that. And obviously, if it's a published scenario, we kind of do a lot of that for you, when there's normally a paragraph or two about the setting that you can literally just draw from without having to go to Wikipedia or anywhere else.
To finish things off then, I want to talk about one of the most exciting but also kind of complicated skills on the investigator sheet, and that's piloting. I've seen so many people building their first Call of Cthulhu character and immediately get drawn to that skill, want to have a plane in the scenario, and there's not a ton of scenarios where, oh, my camera just went very funny there. I'm going to have to take that question again, but I'll do it once you've left. There's not a ton of scenarios out there where you can just start flying around in a plane, but it's a really common player fantasy to be able to bring that in, and it can be excluding for everybody who isn't the plane pilot. How do you get something like that to work in a Globetrotting campaign? Because ideally, this is the place you want to use it.
This can be sometimes a common issue when people who aren't really experienced in how a game like Call of Cthulhu plays. It tends to be newer players who kind of come with a kind of very romantic idea of the especially in the 1920s, 30s, the kind of romance of being a pilot, which is very attractive. But actually, all they are is taxi drivers. And no one comes to Call of Cthulhu, I want to be a taxi driver, because what I want to do is just drive all the characters around, and I want to drive them between all the interesting scenes and do all the dull stuff. That's the same with a pilot. They fly you to somewhere, you get off, and then have something happen. And again, it's like I said earlier, if every time they get on a plane they're attacked by night gaunts, well, you're stretching the credibility of the setting now, and you're suddenly not really playing a kind of a standardized version of Call of Cthulhu, because if the night gaunts are flying and attacking every airplane in the sky, that's a very different setting we're now playing in. So again, you've got to be very careful that and often because obviously you want to work with the players, and maybe having a conversation, say, look, there isn't going to be a lot happening on the plane. You are going to be an essential part because you're flying there, but you've then got to get off the plane and go with them and do that. So are you so this is where you try and build in more depth to their characters. So okay, they're a pilot, but what else are they? Are they an explorer? Are they an adventurer at heart? Are they a risk taker? Do they care or somebody in the party that they need to be able to protect, or they've got a charge, they've got to look after them, so they've got to go with them. Otherwise, they're going to drive up the plane, pilot the plane, land it, and then spend the next 2 hours changing the oil and refilling it, which is a little dull for the player, to be honest. And so you want to not have them do that. So or you talk to them about it, and maybe you're offering some alternatives of not a pilot. Maybe you're a guide, and sometimes you work with pilots to be the navigator, but when the plane lands, you are a local scout, or you can the terrain, and kind of adjust their idea maybe to something that might be more appropriate for the game you're about to play. But really, there's no two ways around it. Pilots in Call of Cthulhu are taxi drivers. And there are a handful of scenarios that are set on a plane, and that's fine. And that maybe you can incorporate that at some point to give the pilot their kind of hour in the spotlight. That would be cool, but you can't really do it all the week, because, as you say, all the other players who aren't pilots, who are sitting there literally just sitting in their chairs in the plane going to sleep, don't have a lot to do. So it's kind of balancing out the party in a sense that makes sure that every player gets some time in the spotlight, without, you know, leaving anyone kind of just sat there twiddling their thumbs.
Finish things off then. I know I said that last time, but really finishing a bonus question. Do you have any final advice for a Globetrotting campaign? And can you tell me one scenario of Call of Cthulhu where I'll get to be in a Zeppelin? Because as soon as you said that, I just had to know. It's a real trigger for me. I'd love to play it.
Okay, my big advice would be, when dealing with logistics in a campaign, really money and logistics are secondary, are really minor to the bigger plot. We're not playing Call of Cthulhu to worry about, you know, accountancy and how we're actually getting from A to B most of the time. We're playing to engage with the cultists who are trying to do this or stop this thing happening, or unveil a mystery, get to the bottom of a mystery. That's why we're playing. That's what excites us. So that's number one. Two, you know, make sure your characters engage, you know, with the style of the Globetrotting campaign. Give them reasons of why they're involved and why they want to travel the world. Make it personal to the characters, and they have a stake in it. That means they're going to go. And in terms of a Zeppelin scenario, the one that springs to mind that has travel on a Zeppelin or a dirigible is in Fearful Passages, which is an older scenario collection that all deals with different, you know, modes of travel. And it's like what I was saying earlier, you know, things can happen in travel, but just not all the time. And there's one called Rigid Air, which takes place on a Zeppelin, and it was written by Phil and Marion Anderson, and is quite a lot of fun and quite deadly, I think, if I remember correctly. So that's an older one. I know that in the Pulp book we did a floor plan of a Zeppelin, because Pulp, and we kind of thought, you know, most Pulp games will feature a Zeppelin at some point, and so there's a lot of more information about Zeppelins in the Pulp Cthulhu book, but none of the adventures in the book, for my shame, take place on the Zeppelin. I left that open for another day for a scenario to come along with something happening on the Zeppelin, and maybe we'll get around to refreshing Rigid Air and get a good Zeppelin scenario out. That would be good to do.